Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that seems like it should belong in a dusty, forgotten corner of history. Imagine the blazing Egyptian sun pounding down on the dry desert, the air so hot it seems to shimmer. But there's a curious thing happening here. What could this seemingly unforgiving desert possibly have in common with immortality? You're about to find out how the ancient Egyptians used the very desert heat to preserve their dead and create the mummies that have fascinated us for thousands of years. You probably won't survive the intense heat yourself, but thankfully, the Egyptians found a way to make the dead last forever. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, post your location and local timelets. See just how far the fascination with mummies has traveled. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Mummification in Egypt wasn't just about death, it was about eternity. For over 3,000 years, Egyptians perfected the art of preserving the body, transforming it into something that could journey into the afterlife. But here's the twist. The Egyptians didn't just depend on their elaborate rituals, intricate embalming practices, or the magical potions they used. They had a secret weapon. The desert. Yes, the desert heat itself played a massive role in helping preserve the body, a factor that we often overlook in the grand drama of Egyptian burial practices. The climate, relentless and scorching, worked alongside the mummifier's skill to ensure that the dead stayed preserved.
Ow.
But how exactly did the environment of the Egyptian desert contribute to this ancient art? The dry air of the desert had a profound impact on the process. Unlike other regions with more humid climates, Egypt's dry heat helped the bodies dry out much faster, reducing decomposition significantly. The high heat and low humidity effectively created an environment perfect for desiccation, a key part of the mummification process. The Egyptians realized that they could use this unique desert environment to accelerate the preservation of the body, and they cleverly capitalized on this advantage. The first step in mummification, as we'll see in a moment, involved the use of special embalming procedures that kept the body from breaking down in the arid desert heat. The early Egyptians had a profound understanding of how the dry climate could work with their embalming methods. But before we get too deep into the process itself, let's take a step back and look at the larger picture of mummification. Ancient Egyptian mummification was deeply tied to their spiritual beliefs, and it wasn't just about physical preservation. For the Egyptians, death wasn't the end. They believed that life continued after death in a parallel world where the soul would journey on. In order to survive in this world, the soul needed a preserved body to inhabit. And that's where the desert heat came in. It played a pivotal role in creating the perfect conditions for mummification, allowing the body to stay intact for thousands of years. Interestingly, historians still debate whether the Egyptians had a clear, unified approach to mummification across all their dynasties. Some scholars argued that there were different methods used at various times, while others maintained that the core principles remained consistent. What we do know for certain is that the process itself evolved. proving over time, as the Egyptians developed more sophisticated techniques, early mummies were often more hastily prepared. But by the time of the New Kingdom, mummification had become an elaborate and highly ritualized art. The embalming process itself was a combination of both science and religion. It was done by a team of specialists, each one tasked with a different aspect of the process. At the heart of the operation were the priests who infused their work with religious rituals and spiritual significance. This ensured that the deceased was not only physically preserved, but spiritually protected for the journey to the afterlife. The mummifiers performed complex rites to ensure that the body would remain intact and impervious to the ravages of time. The Egyptians used a variety of substances to help preserve the body, and one of the most crucial elements in this process was natron. Natron is a naturally occurring mineral, a combination of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate found in abundance in the Egyptian desert. It was so effective at absorbing moisture that it essentially dehydrated the body. For around 40 days, the body would be covered in a thick layer of natron, which would pull the moisture out of the tissues and prevent bacterial growth. This step was vital, as it allowed the body to dry out completely before being sealed away. While natron was doing its job, the mummifiers would carefully remove the internal organs, which were often the first to decompose. The Egyptians believed that the heart was the seat of the soul, so it was always left in place. However, the lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver were removed and carefully preserved in canopic jars. These jars were intricately decorated with faces of the gods and served as a protective measure for the organs, ensuring they would be ready to accompany the soul into the afterlife. Once the body was dried and the organs were preserved, the mummification process took a fascinating turn. The body would be carefully wrapped in linen bandages. Each layer of linen was coated with resin, which helped the wrappings adhere to the body and created a seal that would protect it from the elements. The wrapping process was a slow and deliberate ritual, often taking several weeks to complete. The Egyptians believed that the body needed to be treated with the utmost respect and care, as it was the vessel for the soul's journey. But what about the other aspects of mummification? The linens, resins, and embalming procedures were only part of the equation. The Egyptians believed that the dead needed protection not just from the physical world, but from the supernatural forces that could threaten their passage to the afterlife. This is where amulets and charms came into play. Mummies were often adorned with amulets placed between the layers of linen, each one designed to protect the body from evil spirits and ensure a safe journey through the afterlife. Historians still argue about the exact role of these amulets and how much power the Egyptians believed they possessed. Some scholars maintain that the amulets were purely symbolic, while others believe that the ancient Egyptians saw them as essential tools for spiritual protection, regardless of their role. It's clear that the Egyptians placed great importance on safeguarding the body from both earthly and supernatural threats. As the embalming and wrapping continued, the mummified body would be carefully placed in a coffin, often intricately painted with images of the deceased. The coffin would be placed inside a tomb, which was often elaborately decorated with scenes from the deceased's life and the gods who would guide them into the afterlife. The tomb itself was designed to be a safe space for the dead, a place where the soul could rest until it was time to embark on its final journey. The tombs, as we'll discover, played a significant role in the preservation process. They were built with the same care and attention to detail as the mummies themselves. The tombs were often sealed to protect the body from tomb robbers and the harsh desert conditions. The idea was that the tomb would serve as both a physical and spiritual safeguard, ensuring that the body and the soul would remain intact for eternity. But perhaps the most fascinating part of all is how these mummies continue to live on today. Through modern technology, scientists have been able to peer into the secrets of these ancient practices. CT scans, DNA analysis, and other cutting-edge methods have allowed us to learn more about mummification than the Egyptians themselves ever could have imagined. And yet, the process still holds its mysteries. As we continue this journey into the heart of ancient Egyptian mummification, we'll uncover more secrets about how the heat, the environment, the spiritual rituals all came together to create a method that has stood the test of time. But for now, let's take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity of the Egyptians and the enduring legacy they've left behind. As you stand in the scorching desert, squinting at the barren landscape stretching endlessly before you, it's hard to imagine how this heat could help preserve something. Yet this is the very environment that played a crucial role in one of history's most remarkable preservation techniques. While the Egyptians are often remembered for their majestic pyramids, vast wealth, and religious beliefs, it's their incredible knowledge of the natural world that allowed them to preserve their dead in a way that still mystifies us today. And that heat? It wasn't just a side effect of the climate, it was an essential partner in the mummification process. Picture this. You've just watched as the body of a deceased pharaoh or perhaps a lesser noble was carefully prepared. With organs removed and linen wrapped around, the body like a second skin. But none of that would matter if the climate didn't do its job. The dry heat of the Egyptian desert was, in many ways, the unsung hero of the mummification process. In contrast to the humidity found in other parts of the world, which speeds up decomposition, the dry desert air worked to the Egyptians' advantage by naturally desiccating the body. This was the first key to their success. The desert heat, combined with the dry air, had a unique ability to remove moisture from the body, which was one of the first steps in preserving the corpse. In fact, it was this natural process of dehydration that made the embalming technique so effective. Historians still debate whether mummification could have worked without the assistance of the desert heat, but many agree that the arid climate played a major role. Without it, the embalming process would have taken much longer, and the body would have been much more prone to the ravages of time and decay. It's a bit hard to imagine, isn't it? It's the same heat that scorched the skin and made the desert almost unbearable, also acted as a sort of preservation method. But even though the climate was helpful, the Egyptians still needed a way to harness that heat and moisture in a controlled manner. And that's where their other ingenious methods came into play. First, let's talk about the dry desert environment in a bit more detail. The Egyptian desert isn't just hot, it's relentless. Temperatures during the day could soar above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the night would plunge into a chilling cold. The difference between the extreme highs and lows of desert temperatures helped to speed up the process of desiccation. The body's moisture was drawn out much faster, and the lack of moisture meant bacteria had a much harder time thriving. It wasn't just the heat. It was the absence of humidity, which turned the desert into a natural dehydrator. To understand the significance of the desert climate and mummification, imagine that the human body is like a sponge filled with moisture. If that sponge is left out in a humid environment, it's going to stay wet and break down quickly. But when that sponge is placed in a dry, hot environment, it loses moisture rapidly. This is the core idea behind why the dry desert heat was so beneficial. The Egyptians understood this process intimately. While they might not have had the science we do today, they knew how the environment worked in tandem with their embalming methods to keep the body intact. That said, not all of Egypt's landscape was this dry. Some parts of the country were actually more humid, and those areas didn't see as many mummies. Historians believe that early forms of mummification may have been more prevalent in the dry areas of Upper Egypt, where the climate was most conducive to the rapid dehydration of the body. Over time, as the process became more refined, mummification spread to all parts of Egypt. But the dry desert heat continued to be an essential factor in making it work. Let's take a closer look at what happened next in the embalming process. After the body was dehydrated by the desert heat, it was brought into a more controlled space where embalmers could finish the process. The first task involved removing the internal organs, which was crucial because the organs are where most of the body's fluids are stored. Without this step, the body would still decay far too quickly. But after this was done, it was time to make use of the next essential component of mummification: natron. Natron was a naturally occurring mixture of sodium bicarbonate, sodium carbonate, and small amounts of salt. It had powerful drying properties, making it perfect for the preservation process. The Egyptians would cover the body in natron, allowing it to draw out any remaining moisture from the body. The use of natron was so effective that it became a hallmark of mummification. The body would be left covered in natron for up to 40 days, during which time the salt would absorb moisture, preserving the body. But here's where things get interesting. While the desert heat was essential in drawing out moisture from the body initially, it was the combination of that natural dehydration with the use of natron that made the process so effective. The heat made the natron more powerful, enabling it to act faster. And once the body had been fully dehydrated, it was then sealed, wrapped in linen, and placed in a tomb to continue its preservation. The tomb itself, as we'll see in future sections, played a key role in protecting the body from the elements. The embalming process wasn't just about preservation, though. It was also about the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that the soul needed a preserved body to return to after death. This belief made mummification a spiritual act as much as a physical one. In fact, the embalming process was as much about the soul's journey as it was about preserving the body. The preparation of the body, from the careful removal of organs to the wrapping of the linen, was done with the understanding that the body would eventually be reunited with the soul in the afterlife. Historians still argue whether all Egyptians were mummified in the same way, though. The process was obviously more elaborate for the elite, especially pharaohs and other high-ranking individuals. For the common people, mummification was often less elaborate, and not everyone received the same level of treatment. But no matter the status of the individual, the desert climate was an essential part of the equation. It's fascinating to consider how much the ancient Egyptians were able to achieve with what they had available to them. The hot desert heat, the natural minerals like natron, and their meticulous embalming techniques all came together to create a process that has stood the test of time. And even though we've made great advancements in the study of mummification, there's still so much we don't know. Mummification wasn't just an embalming process, it was a blend of science, religion, and an understanding of the natural world. As we continue exploring the steps of mummification, we'll see how each phase of the process worked hand in hand with the environment. The dry heat wasn't just a background feature, it was an active participant in the story of Egyptian mummies. And as you'll soon discover, it wasn't just the bodies that were preserved. The belief in the afterlife and the care that went into the rituals surrounding death left behind. As the mummification process continued, it wasn't just about the body being preserved. It was also about the larger story of the deceased's journey into the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that the soul would need a preserved body to inhabit in the next world, while it was the desert heat that dried out the bodies. It was the Nile's yearly flooding that allowed Egypt to develop the agricultural system that made their mummification methods possible. Without the agricultural prosperity brought on by the Nile, the resources needed for embalming oils, resins, and other substances would have been far less accessible. The labor required to embalm bodies was expensive, and it was only with a prosperous economy, supported by the floodwaters of the Nile, that the mummification process could be sustained. And resin substances that were highly valued by the Egyptians for both their preservative properties and their ability to create pleasant aromas. They acted as an adhesive to help keep the linen wrappings in place, and they also played a critical role in protecting the body from decomposition. By coating the body with a layer of resin, the embalmers ensured that the mummified body would be sealed against the elements for eternity. The resin would harden over time, creating an impermeable shell that preserved the body's integrity. But before this could begin, the body was typically anointed with various oils, resins, and sometimes even spices. The idea behind this was twofold: to help preserve the body further and to make it fragrant for the afterlife. Imagine for a moment the rich smells of frankincense and myrrh filling the air as the embalmer wrapped the body in linen, each layer being carefully laid and sealed with resin. The process would have taken several weeks, and the embalmers were highly skilled in their craft, working with a sense of reverence and duty. The dry desert air helped preserve the body, but over time tombs could be looted or disturbed. Some argue that tomb robbers had a far more significant impact on the preservation of mummies than we'd like to admit. Others believe that tombs, when undisturbed, were able to keep the mummies in a state of relative preservation for thousands of years. The answer probably lies somewhere in the middle, with tombs that remained undisturbed being better preserved than those that were looted or damaged. Many tombs, especially those of the more famous figures like pharaohs, were looted by thieves looking for valuable items. Despite this, many mummies have survived the millennia, preserved not just by the physical processes of embalming, but by the spiritual protections that the Egyptians believed were built into the tomb. This process, combined with the desiccating powers of Natron and the dry desert air, meant that the mummified bodies of Egypt's elite could last for thousands of years. As each layer of linen was added, amulets were placed in strategic spots between the layers to protect the deceased from evil spirits and ensure a safe journey into the afterlife. These amulets, crafted from gold, precious stones, and other materials, were believed to have magical properties invoking the protection of the gods. The number and types of amulets used varied depending on the status of the individual, more prestigious mummies receiving more elaborate and numerous protections. These oils were made from various plants and resins found in Egypt and traded from far-off lands, such as frankincense, myrrh, and cedar wood. But the tomb wasn't just a final resting place. It was a carefully constructed sanctuary for the body, designed to ensure its protection for eternity. The tomb would often be filled with food offerings, treasures, and items that the deceased might need in the afterlife. These items were meant to provide comfort and sustenance to the deceased as they embarked on their journey. They could be anything from simple jars of grain to intricately crafted jewelry or small statues of gods and goddesses. Frankincense in particular was incredibly prized for its fragrance, and it became an essential part of the mummification process. The tomb, with all its protections and offerings, was seen as a vital part of the mummification process. It wasn't just a burial, it was a continuation of life. The tomb was a sacred space, a place where the deceased could rest until their soul was reunited with the body in the afterlife. Some believe that the mummification process was reserved only for the elite, with commoners receiving much simpler burials. In contrast, others argue that the ancient Egyptians practiced mummification in varying degrees, depending on the resources available. However, regardless of the level of elaborateness, all Egyptians shared a common belief that death was a continuation of life, it's not an end, and that the preservation of the body was an essential component of this belief. It's fascinating to think that the Egyptians weren't just embalming bodies. They were also attempting to give the dead a sense of peace, comfort, and even luxury in the afterlife. In some cases, the deceased were even anointed with perfume, a sign of respect and honor. This is why many of the tombs of the wealthier Egyptians, particularly the pharaohs, are found near the Nile. It wasn't just for symbolic reasons. It was about access to resources and practicality. Every year, the Nile would flood its banks, depositing rich silt that fertilized the land, enabling the Egyptians to grow the abundant crops that supported their society. The process was a deeply religious ritual that transcended wealth. It was believed that all individuals, from pharaohs to commoners, needed to be prepared for the afterlife. The Egyptians understood the importance of mummification in maintaining the physical form. And while the methods used might differ between the social classes, the central tenets of the process remained the same. These crops in turn fed the embalmers and priests who carried out the rituals of death, They also believed that the tomb itself, with all its rituals and protections, was a place of sacred rest, a stopover before embarking on the journey to eternity. But let us pause for a moment and revisit the role of the Nile River in all of this. The Nile, Egypt's life source, not only provided water for the civilization, but also contributed significantly to the process of mummification. So you might be wondering, what does this have to do with mummification? Quite a lot, actually. Historians still debate the extent to which the Nile itself was seen as a symbol of life and death in ancient Egyptian culture. Many scholars believe that the river was associated with rebirth, much like the annual flooding that brought new life to the soil. This connection to life and death would have been incredibly important when it came to mummification, as the Egyptians believed that the preservation of the body was key to ensuring rebirth in the afterlife. In some respects, the Nile represented the eternal cycle of life, death and rebirth, and this was closely tied to their religious views and burial practices. As the embalming process continued, the body was often treated with oils, resins, like the ones used for embalming, were incredibly important. While the wealthy enjoyed elaborate embalming practices, including the use of expensive oils and perfumes, the mummification process was still essential for all Egyptians, regardless of their status. Historians still argue whether the embalming process was as rigorous for everyone. After the body was embalmed, the next step in the process was to carefully wrap it in layers of linen. The embalming priests, dedicated to their work, would wrap the body from head to toe in linen, making sure that every inch of the body was covered. Once the wrapping was complete, the body was placed inside a coffin, which was then sealed and placed in a tomb. Inside the tomb, there would often be inscriptions and images depicting scenes from the deceased's life, as well as prayers and spells designed to protect the soul as it made its way through the afterlife. Even though the tomb was meant to protect the body, the elements still posed a significant threat. Historians still debate how effective the tombs were in protecting the mummies. Now, as you continue your journey through the ancient world, it's impossible to ignore the spiritual layer that permeated every aspect of mummification. Yes, the physical process of preserving the body was impressive on its own, but the Egyptians' deep religious beliefs took the entire procedure to another level. For the ancient Egyptians, mummification wasn't just about keeping the body intact for physical preservation. It was about ensuring that the soul could continue its journey into the afterlife. Without the body's preservation, the soul would not have a vessel to return to, and it would be doomed to wander forever, unable to enter the paradise that awaited it. The embalming process, intricate as it was, served a dual purpose. First, it ensured that the body, that sacred vessel, would remain whole, able to endure the trials of the afterlife. But secondly, it helped protect the soul from any external threats, be it demons, spirits, or forces of evil. The heart of the mummification process was deeply tied to the Egyptian concept of Ka and Ba, the two essential parts of the soul. The Ka was believed to represent life force, while the Ba represented the personality and spirit of the individual. The preservation of the body was meant to ensure the Ka and Ba would reunite, giving the deceased eternal life in the afterlife. This was why the body couldn't just be preserved physically. It had to be spiritually safeguarded as well. As you strolled through this world, you realized that the Egyptians weren't simply burying their dead. They were engaging in a complex spiritual ritual, a journey filled with protections, prayers, and amulets that made the preservation process an act of divine importance. Historians still argue whether all mummies received the same level of spiritual protection. For the royals, mummification was undoubtedly more elaborate, complete with an extensive array of protective amulets, incantations, and personal belongings. Commoners, however, had a much simpler form of mummification, and while their bodies were still preserved with natron and resin, their tombs were often much less elaborate, with fewer protections provided for their souls. The entire mummification process was overseen by priests, who were skilled in the religious aspects of embalming and the rituals associated with death. These priests were the gatekeepers of the sacred knowledge, and only they could perform the rites necessary to ensure the deceased would be protected in the afterlife. They would recite prayers, invoke the gods, and carefully perform the rituals associated with the preservation of the body. This act was not only a physical process, it was a deeply sacred spiritual one that tied the deceased to the gods and ensured their place in eternity. Let's take a step back and dive deeper into the mummification rituals that were a part of every embalming. The first significant step involved removing the internal organs. The Egyptians believed that the body could not function properly in the afterlife unless the organs were preserved. And so, the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were removed. In most cases, the heart was left in place, as it was considered the seat of the soul. But the organs that were removed were not discarded. They were carefully embalmed and stored in special containers known as canopic jars. These jars were often decorated with the faces of the four sons of Horus, each representing a different aspect of the body and offering divine protection. The embalming priests would then proceed to dry out the body, using the natural benefits of the desert heat and natron to draw out moisture. This was done in preparation for the next step, wrapping the body in linen. But this wasn't just a physical act. It was deeply ritualistic. Each layer of linen that wrapped the body represented a layer of protection for the soul. As each layer was added, more prayers and amulets were placed within the folds of the linen. Some historians believe that the mummifiers saw the wrapping as a way of ensuring that the deceased would not fall prey to the evil forces in the afterlife. This ritual also helped protect the body from decay, making sure that the spirit could always find its way back to a recognizable form. But it wasn't just the body that was prepared for the afterlife. The tomb itself was a critical part of the journey. After the body was mummified, it was placed in a coffin, often made of wood or stone, and sealed with the appropriate spells to ensure it remained undisturbed. The tomb would be filled with items for the deceased to use in the afterlife. These could range from everyday objects to more elaborate goods such as food, clothes, and jewelry, all of which were meant to provide comfort and sustenance in the afterlife. As you imagine this scene, picture the priests carefully sealing the tomb. The tomb was not just a place of burial, it was also a spiritual sanctuary. The burial chamber would often be decorated with images of the deceased gods and symbols of eternal life, and it was believed that the tomb would serve as a protector of the body. The tomb was also seen as the place where the deceased would undergo the final stages of their journey, transitioning from the physical world to the afterlife, a process that could take many years. Historians still argue about the significance of the burial goods placed in the tomb. Some believe they were purely symbolic, representing the deceased's earthly life, while others believe that these items were meant to provide actual comfort in the afterlife. Regardless of the interpretation, it's clear that these burial rituals played a significant role in Egyptian culture. The tomb, the body, and the spirit were all part of an intricate system that ensured the deceased soul could survive for eternity. Moving beyond the burial practices, we also find that the Egyptians placed great importance on spells and incantations. The famous Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and prayers, was often placed in the tombs of the deceased to help guide the soul through the afterlife. These texts were meant to protect the deceased from harm and to help them pass through the various trials they would face before entering the afterlife. The spells and prayers were also designed to ensure that the soul could reunite with its body, thus allowing the deceased to live eternally. Interestingly, historians still debate the exact role of these spells and incantations. Some believe that the Egyptians thought these words had literal power to protect the dead, while others argue that the texts were more symbolic, serving as a guide to the soul's journey. Either way, it's clear that the Egyptians saw these words as essential for the journey, and they played a crucial role in the success of mummification and burial. The journey into the afterlife was seen as a perilous one, and many believed that the soul would face numerous trials and dangers along the way. The embalming process and the careful preparation of the body were meant to help the deceased navigate these challenges and ultimately find peace in the afterlife. The mummification process was an act of devotion, and it wasn't just about preserving the body, it was about ensuring the soul's eternal rest. As you continue through this exploration, you realize just how deeply intertwined the process of mummification was with the Egyptian worldview. It wasn't merely a means of preserving the dead, it was a spiritual journey that transcended death itself. The mummification process served as a link between life and death, ensuring that the deceased could continue their existence in the afterlife. It's no wonder that mummification became one of the most intricate and important rituals in Egyptian culture. Blending. As you stand here in the midst of this ancient landscape, contemplating the monumental task that the Egyptians undertook in preserving the dead, it's impossible not to marvel at the scale and intricacy of their efforts. The mummification process wasn't just about physical preservation. It was about ensuring that the soul had everything it needed to thrive in the afterlife. This concept was deeply ingrained in Egyptian religion, where death was not seen as the end, but rather as a continuation of life in a different realm. But to understand the full extent of this belief, we need to take a closer look at the role of gods, magic, and the eternal quest for immortality. The Egyptians firmly believed that the afterlife was a spiritual continuation of the life they had known on earth. Others argue that they were believed to have actual tangible power that could ward off evil forces. The use of incantations and spells was also an essential part of the mummification ritual. For example, one of the most important passages was the weighing of the heart scene, where the heart of the deceased would be weighed against the feather of Mat, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was found to be light and free from sin, the soul would pass into the afterlife. The tomb itself, where the body would be laid to rest, played a pivotal role in the preservation process. Not just a burial site, the tomb was a sacred space where the deceased could begin their journey into the afterlife. The tomb would be carefully sealed, often with stones and heavy barriers to keep out intruders. But the tomb wasn't just a physical protector, it was also a spiritual one. Some believe that the Egyptians saw death as a kind of eternal rest, a peaceful existence in the afterlife. Others argue that the journey was more complex, involving trials, challenges, and even battles for the soul. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing is clear. The Egyptians believed that death was not the end, but rather a continuation of life. And mummification was the key to ensuring that the soul could continue on its journey to live forever among the gods. It was designed to keep the soul's journey intact, ensuring that it would have the space and security it needed to transition into eternity. But if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, the soul would be devoured by the monster Ammit, and the journey would end in eternal death. These items weren't just meant to be symbolic, they were practical necessities for the journey. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul needed physical sustenance just as much as it needed spiritual protection. This was why so many tombs were filled with jars of food, statues, and even models of servants to provide for the deceased in the afterlife. The spells were meant to ensure that the heart was light and the soul could pass through this final judgment unscathed. In carvings that depicted scenes from the deceased's life, as well as prayers and spells for their protection, the body, the soul, and the tomb were all intricately designed to work together, ensuring that the deceased would be able to join the gods in eternal life. The process of mummification, with all its intricate steps, was the key to this eternal journey. But what made the process even more extraordinary was the belief that life would continue beyond death. Else these images were not just decorative, they were essential to the process of ensuring a successful passage into the afterlife. The tomb's walls were often covered with representations of the gods, each one offering protection and guidance for the deceased as they embarked on their final journey. The Egyptians believed that these words held immense power. The mere recitation of the proper spell could turn the tide in favor of the soul, ensuring that it would overcome any obstacles. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and prayers, was often placed in the tomb with the deceased. These texts guided the soul through the underworld, offering protection and advice for each phase of the journey. Regardless of the precise belief system, amulets were essential components of the mummification process. Each one carefully chosen and placed with the intention of ensuring a safe passage to the afterlife. For example, the scarab amulet, often placed over the heart of the deceased, was meant to symbolize the heart's judgment before the gods. This was just one of many amulets that provided the deceased with magical assistance. For this reason, mummification was not merely an embalming process, it was a divine act of protection. The soul, or Ba, would leave the body upon death, but it could return to the preserved body at will. In order for this to happen, the body had to be intact and free from decay. Some believe that it was primarily a guidebook or roadmap for the soul to follow in the afterlife. Others argue that the Egyptians believed the spells had actual magical power, capable of altering the fate of the deceased. One thing is certain, however, the spiritual aspect of the mummification process was just as important as the physical. The body may have been preserved with natron and resins, but the soul was preserved through the use of magic, amulets, and prayers. But it wasn't just the body that needed protection. The soul also required safeguards from the myriad dangers that awaited it on its journey to the afterlife. This is where the magic of the mummification process came in. The Egyptians didn't just rely on physical methods to preserve the body, they also invoked powerful spells, rituals. Each amulet had a specific purpose, and many were engraved with names of gods, symbols of protection, or prayers for divine intervention. The purpose of these amulets was clear. They were meant to offer protection from evil spirits and ensure that the soul would be able to pass safely through the trials of the afterlife. Historians still debate just how powerful these amulets were in the minds of the Egyptians did. They truly believe in their mystical power, or were they more symbolic in nature? Protective charms to ensure the deceased could successfully navigate the perils of the afterlife. In fact, they believed that the afterlife was full of trials, obstacles, and gods who could either help or hinder the soul's passage. To overcome these challenges, the deceased needed the assistance of the gods, and to call on these divine forces, they had to be properly prepared. Enter the role of amulets. These small, often intricately carved items were placed between the layers of linen bandages or within the wrappings of the mummified body. Some scholars believe that the amulets served a purely spiritual purpose, acting as symbols of the god's protection and invoking divine favor. But the amulets were not the only magical protections the Egyptians employed. The spells contained in the Book of the Dead were designed to help the soul navigate various challenges. Historians are still debating the true function of the Book of the Dead. But the relationship between the body, the soul, and the gods didn't end once the body was mummified. Inside the tomb, the deceased would be surrounded by various offerings, including food, drink, and personal items, all meant to provide comfort and sustenance for the soul. In addition to these offerings, the tomb would often contain inscriptions, murals. As you continue to explore this ancient practice, it becomes clear that the Egyptians took great care in preparing their dead for the afterlife. Historians still argue about the specifics of the Egyptian view of the afterlife. As the sun sets over the vast Egyptian desert, painting the sky with hues of orange and red, you begin to realize that the journey of the mummified body is far from over. For the Egyptians, the afterlife was not a solitary journey. It was a world teeming with gods, dangers, and the promise of immortality. The mummification process, with all its rituals and protections, was designed to prepare the deceased for this world beyond death. While it may seem like the embalming process ends with the wrapping of the body and its placement in the tomb, this is only part of the story. In this trial, the heart of the deceased was placed on a scale, where it was weighed against the feather of Mat, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was found to be light, free from sin, the soul could pass into the afterlife. The soul's journey through the duat was one of transformation, where it shed the burdens of earthly life and became one with the divine. The Egyptians believed that the deceased could still influence the lives of their descendants, offering protection, blessings, and guidance. While it's true that pharaohs and high-ranking officials received elaborate tombs and mummification rituals, the concept of the afterlife was available to all Egyptians. Even the most humble individuals could expect to receive some form of mummification, depending on their wealth and status. The goal was the same: to ensure that the soul could live on in eternity, regardless of the individual's earthly status. In return, the living would continue to honor their ancestors, providing food offerings, prayers, and other acts of devotion to ensure the soul's peace. The rituals surrounding mummification were intended to ensure that the deceased could live on in peace, surrounded by the protection of the gods. Was it a place of rest and peace, or was it a realm of trial and transformation? Some argue that the Egyptians saw the afterlife as a continuation of earthly life, while others believe that it was a place of divine judgment and renewal. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing is clear: the Egyptians believed that death was not the end, but a new beginning. And the mummification process, with all its complexities and rituals, was the key to ensuring that this new beginning would be a safe and prosperous one. It was an act of devotion, of love, and of hope. The Egyptians didn't just preserve the body, they preserved the soul. And in doing so, they ensured that the journey into the afterlife would be one of safety, protection, and eventual reunion with the divine. While it is clear that the wealthy and powerful had more elaborate tombs and burial practices, it's also evident that the mummification process was a widespread practice. The pharaohs, as divine rulers, were seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people. These tombs were vast, elaborate structures filled with treasures, food offerings, and statues designed to accompany the pharaoh on his journey. The tombs were often decorated with scenes of the pharaoh's life, as well as depictions of the gods who would guide him through the afterlife. In these tombs, the pharaoh was not just being buried, he was being prepared for an eternal reign. Their tombs were the grandest, their mummification the most elaborate. But even as the mummification process became more accessible to the broader population, it was always closely tied to religious and political power. The pharaohs were not just rulers, they were gods, and their bodies were preserved to ensure that they could continue their divine rule in the afterlife. Some scholars argue that the quality of mummification varied, with commoners receiving simpler versions of the process, while others believe that mummification was reserved only for the elite, regardless of the specific practices. The idea that the afterlife was a realm open to all Egyptians is central to their religious worldview. This relationship between the living and the dead was an essential part of Egyptian culture and religious life. The preservation of the body was just one part of this process. The mummified body served as a vessel for the soul's return, but it was the spiritual rituals, the prayers, and the amulets that ensured the soul would be protected during its trials in the afterlife. But if the heart was heavy, weighed down by sin, it would be devoured by the monstrous Ammit, and the soul would be condemned to oblivion. This moment was one of the most critical points in the deceased's journey, and it's no surprise that it was depicted so frequently in tombs and burial rituals. This realm was full of challenges, trials, and obstacles, each one designed to test the soul's worthiness for eternal life. The deceased had to pass through a series of gates, each guarded by a deity or an obstacle. These gates represented the various dangers the soul would face on its journey. They were often depicted in tomb paintings or carved into the walls of the burial chamber, showing the deceased overcoming these obstacles with the help of the gods. The spells in the Book of the Dead were designed to help the soul navigate these gates, cueing that it would not be hindered by malevolent forces or be led astray by demons. The BA would have to pass through various gates and face trials before it could reach the afterlife, known as the Field of Reeds, where the soul would live in peace for eternity. The tomb was not just a resting place, it was a starting point for this complex and dangerous journey. The soul, or Ba, continues its journey through a world that is both familiar and perilous. The tomb, while a place of rest, also serves as a threshold to the afterlife, a boundary between the realm of the living and the eternal life that the Egyptians believed awaited them. The concept of the afterlife was one that deeply influenced every aspect of Egyptian life. It wasn't just about physical preservation, it was about spiritual transcendence. After the embalming process was complete, the soul of the deceased was believed to begin its journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. One of the most famous depictions of this journey is found in the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, prayers, and incantations designed to guide the deceased through the Duat. The Book of the Dead was placed in the tomb, alongside the body, to ensure the soul had the necessary tools to navigate the afterlife. It wasn't just a guidebook, it was a magical text, believed to hold actual power. Some scholars argue that the Egyptians saw the Book of the Dead as a literal roadmap, while others suggest it was more of a symbolic guide. Either way, the Book of the Dead was seen as an essential tool for the soul's survival. The most well-known scene in the Book of the Dead is the weighing of the heart. But it wasn't just the heart that was tested. As you continue to ponder the intricate journey of the soul, it becomes clear that the Egyptians didn't see death as a final destination, they saw it as a continuation of life, albeit in a different realm. One of the most fascinating aspects of this journey was the belief that the soul could interact with the living world even after death. But the afterlife wasn't just a realm for the elite. Historians still debate the extent to which mummification was accessible to all Egyptians. The mummification process was also closely tied to the political and social structure of ancient Egypt. The tombs of the pharaohs, such as those in the Valley of the Kings, are some of the most famous examples of Egyptian burial practices. But even as the mummification process was tied to the elite, it was also a deeply personal experience. Historians still debate the precise meaning of the afterlife in Egyptian culture. As you delve deeper into the ritualized journey of mummification, the vastness of Egyptian beliefs about death and the afterlife becomes even more inspiring. While the mummification process was essential in preserving the body for eternity, it was also a deeply symbolic act, imbued with powerful spiritual meaning. This belief permeated every aspect of Egyptian society, from the royal tombs to the most humble graves. Regardless of one's social status, the afterlife was seen as a realm open to all who had undergone the proper rites. The Egyptians believed that Osiris' triumph over death mirrored the soul's journey through the afterlife. The path to the afterlife was fraught with dangers, the most significant being the weighing of the heart ceremony. The god Anubis, the jackal-headed deity of embalming, and the protector of graves, oversaw the weighing process. It was his role to ensure that the heart was placed on the scales and that the trial was conducted fairly. Some believe that the soul's journey was more of a symbolic representation of personal growth and moral purification, while others maintain that it was a literal path the soul had to traverse. The Egyptians saw death and the afterlife as a communal experience, and the living were responsible for ensuring the success of the deceased's journey. Rituals, prayers, and offerings to the gods were performed regularly to honor the deceased and to maintain their connection with the living world. Egyptians believed that some souls were not worthy of eternal life. It wasn't just a physical process, it was a deeply spiritual act that connected the living and the dead, the physical and the divine. Mummification, in all its intricacies and rituals, was the gateway to eternity, and the Egyptians' belief in the afterlife shaped every aspect of their culture. Their knowledge of the body, the soul, and the gods created a sophisticated system of preservation and protection that has endured for thousands of years. These souls, weighed down by sin or wrongdoings, would be cast out, never to enter the peaceful realm of the field of reeds. This idea of divine judgment was central to the Egyptian worldview. It reinforced the importance of living a righteous life in accordance with the principles of Mat in order to secure a place in the afterlife. These acts of devotion were seen as essential for keeping the deceased's soul alive and well in the afterlife, regardless of the interpretation. The central idea remained the same. The journey through the afterlife was one of transformation. The mummification process, with its careful rituals and spiritual intent, remains one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient Egyptian culture. And as we continue to uncover the mysteries of the past, we realize just how much the Egyptians understood about life, death, and the eternal quest for immortality. The living ensured the preservation of the body and soul, while the deceased were expected to continue watching over their family, providing blessings and protection. The tomb, with its riches, prayers, and offerings, was the focal point of this contract. It was a sacred space where the living could communicate with the dead. The dead could, in turn, offer their blessings and guidance. The soul had to be purified, tested, and judged before it could reach the eternal realm of peace and renewal. Alongside Anubis stood Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, who recorded the outcome of the trial. These gods were not just passive observers, they were active participants in the journey, providing guidance and, in some cases, protection. Some gods, like Osiris and Ra, were seen as benevolent figures who helped the soul achieve immortality. Others, like Set and Ammit, represented the forces of chaos and destruction, always seeking to disrupt the soul's journey. The relationship between the soul and these gods was one of constant negotiation. The deceased would often call on these deities for protection or invoke their names in prayers and spells to ensure a smooth passage through the afterlife. These gods, along with Osiris, played a crucial role in determining the fate of the soul. For the Egyptians, this ceremony was the ultimate test of morality, and it determined whether the soul would continue to live in the eternal paradise of the field of reeds or be cast into oblivion. This trial, which took place in the Hall of Judgment, was one of the most crucial moments in the deceased's journey. The deceased's heart, which was believed to be the seat of the soul, was weighed against the feather of Mat, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was found to be lighter than the feather, it signified a life lived in accordance with Mat, and the soul would be granted access to the afterlife. However, if the heart was found to be heavier laden with guilt, sin, or wrongdoings, the soul would be devoured by the fearsome creature Ammit, who had the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Those who were properly mummified, having undergone the rituals and ceremonies of embalming, were believed to share in Osiris's resurrection, gaining access to a world beyond death. This concept was tied to the notion of Ak, or blessedness, which signified the soul's transformation into an eternal and divine being. In the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, the deceased would encounter a series of gates, each one guarded by fierce gods or other supernatural beings. These gates were symbolic obstacles that represented various challenges the soul would need to overcome. The deceased had to recite specific spells, known as the spells for going forth by day, to pass through each gate unharmed. These spells were believed to have magical properties, and the proper incantations would allow the soul to move forward in its journey. For the Egyptians, magic and words were powerful tools, and they believed that uttering the right phrase at the right moment could change the course of fate. Only those who were worthy, having passed the trials of the afterlife, could achieve this state of blessedness. But the journey wasn't an easy one. The deceased had to pass through trials, tests, and encounters with deities who would either aid or obstruct their progress. For the Egyptians, the afterlife wasn't simply a continuation of life. Osiris was often depicted as a mummified figure, symbolizing both the physical preservation of the body and the spiritual continuity of life. His myth was central to Egyptian religious beliefs about death. Osiris was believed to have been the first ruler of Egypt, who was killed and dismembered by his brother Set. However, through the mourning and ritual efforts of his wife, Isis, Osiris was resurrected. This story of death and resurrection became the model for the journey of every Egyptian soul. But a grand mystical realm governed by powerful deities, each responsible for guiding and protecting the soul on its eternal journey. Central to this belief system was the understanding that death wasn't an end, but a transition into a new state of existence. One of the most important figures in this journey was Osiris, the god of the afterlife, resurrection, and judgment. Osiris's resurrection was not just a personal victory, it was a universal one. But what exactly did these trials look like, and how did the deceased navigate them? The process of the weighing of the heart was far from simple, and it required the guidance of several gods. But the weighing of the heart was just one of many trials the soul would face on its journey. Historians still argue over the exact nature of the trials faced by the soul in the duat. Beyond the trials of the duat, the deceased also had to contend with the gods themselves. It's worth noting that the Egyptians didn't just believe that the afterlife was an individual journey. The living also had a significant role to play. In many ways, the mummification process can be seen as a social contract between the living and the dead. But even with all the protections, rituals, and divine assistance, the journey through the afterlife was not guaranteed. As you reflect on the incredible complexity of Egyptian religious beliefs, you begin to understand why mummification was such a central part of their culture. Historians continue to study these ancient practices, fascinated by the level of detail and the deep religious significance behind them. As you continue to wander through the labyrinth of Egyptian beliefs, the overwhelming sense of the importance placed on death and the afterlife begins to settle in. The journey of the soul, the preservation of the body, and the mystical realm of gods and spirits were far more than a belief system to the Egyptians. They were an intricate part of life itself. The tombs of the pharaohs, nobles, and even commoners were not just places of burial, they were designed as lavish sanctuaries, reflecting the belief that the afterlife was not only eternal, but also filled with comforts and rewards. These tombs were often laden with treasures, jewels, fine furniture, food, and even small models of servants meant to ensure that the deceased would want for nothing once they entered the next realm. It's fascinating to think that for the Egyptians, the tomb wasn't just a burial site, it was a symbolic continuation of life. The deceased were buried with food, drink, and other items they would need to continue their existence in the afterlife. But this wasn't a mere physical sustenance. It was a reflection of their belief in the eternal nature of life. Were they simply symbolic representations? Or did the Egyptians believe that these images had the power to affect the soul's journey? The Egyptians didn't just believe in a single deity, but a vast pantheon of gods, each responsible for different aspects of the natural and spiritual world. These gods were seen as both protectors and judges, overseeing everything from the preservation of the body to the fate of the soul in the afterlife. Some scholars argued that the Egyptians saw their tomb art as a way of ensuring that the soul would have the proper spiritual tools to succeed in the afterlife. But the role of these gods was far from passive. They didn't see death as a finality, but as a passage to a new existence. The mummification process, with its intricate rituals, amulets, prayers, and spells, was a testament to the Egyptians' belief in the eternal. While other cultures may have had similar beliefs in the afterlife, few went to the lengths that the Egyptians did to preserve and protect their dead. They didn't just preserve the bodies of their dead, they preserved the very essence of life itself, ensuring that the soul would never be lost and that the journey to the afterlife would be as grand and eternal as life itself. The mummification process was a profound expression of their belief in the power of the soul and the eternal nature of life. It wasn't just about preserving the body. It was about ensuring that the soul would continue to exist in the world of the gods, experiencing rebirth and immortality. The care with which they preserved the body, the rituals they performed, and the offerings they made were all part of a larger belief system that saw life as cyclical and never-ending journey through birth, life, death, and rebirth. They weren't just spiritual guides, they were actively involved in ensuring that the deceased made it to the afterlife. For example, Anubis, the god of embalming, is believed to protect the body during the mummification process and guide the soul on its journey. Similarly, Osiris, the god of resurrection, was seen as the ruler of the afterlife, ensuring that the soul was granted eternal life after passing through the trials of the Duat. After all, these scenes weren't just decorative. They're often filled with divine imagery and symbols meant to invoke the protection of the gods. This relationship between the gods and the dead was one of mutual responsibility. The gods provided protection and guidance, but the living also had to fulfill their obligations to the gods through rituals, offerings, and prayers. The relationship between the living and the divine was symbiotic, with both parties relying on each other to ensure the success of the journey. The tomb walls were a space where the living and the dead could interact, and where the spiritual journey of the deceased could be affirmed and reinforced. The act of preparing for death wasn't something done only by the elite. It was a practice that touched every Egyptian, from the pharaohs to the commoners. While the wealthy might have had more elaborate tombs and more ornate burial rituals, the belief in the afterlife was universal. The idea that life continued after death in a world of gods, spirits, and eternal rewards was something that resonated with all Egyptians, regardless of social class. The deceased were expected to continue their roles as ancestors, offering blessings and protection to the living in return for their offerings and rituals. Historians still marvel at the sheer opulence of some of these tombs, particularly those of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. The walls of these tombs were often decorated with elaborate murals depicting scenes from the deceased's life. These scenes were not just representations of their earthly existence, they were also symbolic representations of the deceased's journey through the afterlife. The artwork would often include images of gods, the deceased's family, and scenes of the afterlife, where the deceased would encounter divine beings and face the challenges of their journey. Each step in the mummification process, from the preparation of the body to the sealing of the tomb, these images were meant to remind the soul of the trials ahead and the importance of living a righteous life. But they were also a reminder to the living. By viewing these images, the family and descendants of the deceased were reminded of their duty to honor the dead and ensure that their loved ones would find peace in the afterlife. It was infused with a sense of permanence and spirituality, as though life and death were simply two sides of the same coin. But as with all civilizations, their views on the afterlife and the rituals they practiced were constantly evolving, reflecting the changing dynamics of their culture and religion. One of the most remarkable aspects of ancient Egyptian society is how their views on death and the afterlife influenced their material culture. But beyond the physical wealth that accompanied the dead, there was an equally rich spiritual investment in the afterlife. The Egyptians didn't just prepare the body and the tomb for the dead. They also ensured that the deceased was spiritually equipped to face whatever came next. As we've already explored, this was where the Book of the Dead came in, with its intricate spells and incantations. The Book of the Dead was, in a sense, spiritual passport, one that guided the soul through the treacherous terrain of the afterlife. The spells contained within it offered protection, wisdom, and divine favor, allowing the deceased to overcome any obstacle they might encounter in the duat, the Egyptian underworld. The tomb was the final home of the deceased, but it was also the gateway to the eternal. One of the most striking things about Egyptian tombs is their artwork. For example, many tombs contain depictions of the weighing of the heart, with Osiris presiding over the judgment of the soul. Historians continue to debate the role of these depictions. It's not just the tombs and their contents that speak to the spiritual devotion of the Egyptians, as also their complex views on the gods. At the heart of this belief system were gods like Osiris, Anubis, and Ra, who were responsible for guiding the deceased through the various stages of the afterlife. These gods were not just figures of worship, they were seen as real, tangible forces that influenced every aspect of the deceased's journey. What's most striking, however, is how the Egyptians' belief in the afterlife permeated all aspects of their lives. In this sense, the Egyptian mummification process can be seen as an expression of their deep respect for life and death. Historians still marvel at the sophistication of this belief system and the incredible level of care and devotion the Egyptians put into their burial practices. In this way, the Egyptians' views on death and the afterlife set them apart from many other ancient civilizations. As you step away from this world of mummies, gods, and eternal journeys, it's clear that the Egyptians saw death not as the end, but as a continuation of a grand cosmic cycle. As we venture further into the depths of ancient Egyptian beliefs, the intricate layers of death and the afterlife begin to reveal even more fascinating complexities. The Egyptians' views on immortality, rebirth, and divine protection were not merely abstract concepts. They were lived realities that shaped the daily lives of every individual. From the pharaohs to the common people, Mat was not just a deity. She represented the very principles that governed the universe. The Egyptians believed that the world operated on a delicate balance, one that needed to be maintained for the universe to function harmoniously. The heart was seen as a reflection of the individual's life on earth. If the deceased had lived in accordance with Matwith's truth, justice, and harmony, then their heart would be light and pure, allowing them to pass into the afterlife. The deceased were not expected to navigate the afterlife alone. Osiris's role in Egyptian religious thought was immense. He was seen as the ruler of the afterlife, the one who would welcome the deceased into the eternal realm. The flooding of the Nile was a cyclical event that brought new life to the land. Just as Osiris, death and resurrection symbolized the renewal of life in the afterlife, The Egyptians believed that the soul-less journey through the duat was a necessary step in this process of cosmic renewal. It was through the trials, judgment, and eventual resurrection that the soul could achieve its place in the eternal realm. Osiris was also closely associated with the concepts of death and rebirth. The tomb, with its treasures, food offerings, and divine imagery, was a crucial part of the process. They were carefully crafted representations of the spiritual journey, meant to provide the deceased with the guidance and protection they needed to pass through the afterlife. These images and inscriptions often depicted scenes of the deceased interacting with gods and receiving their divine protection. They were meant to invoke the favor of the gods, ensuring that the deceased would be granted eternal life. The tomb wasn't just a place of burial, it was a space that facilitated the soulless journey into eternity. The process of mummification, the rituals, the divine protections were all part of a larger belief system that sought to ensure that the soul could transcend death and live forever. The Egyptians didn't just preserve the body, they preserved the very essence of life itself, ensuring that the soul would continue to exist in a world of gods, rebirth, and eternal peace. The goods placed in the tomb, whether they were food, jewelry, or personal items, were meant to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. These items were often placed in the tomb with the belief that they would be needed for the soul's journey, whether to provide nourishment or to ensure that the deceased had the proper tools for their spiritual rebirth. In tombs, the deceased were often depicted in scenes with Osiris, reinforcing the idea that Osiris was there to guide them through the afterlife. These scenes were not only artistic representations, they were thought to provide the deceased with the divine protection they would need to navigate the challenges of the duat. By invoking Osiris's name and seeking his protection, the deceased were believed to gain his favor, ensuring that their journey would be successful and that they would be granted eternal life. His myth, which tells the story of his death and resurrection, was central to the Egyptians' understanding of the afterlife. One of the most common ways to ensure a smooth passage was through the use of protective spells, many of which were found in the Book of the Dead. This spell was often performed by priests during the mummification process, and it was believed to restore the senses of the deceased so that they could interact with the world of the living and the dead. The ritual involved the symbolic opening of the mouth, which allowed the deceased to breathe, speak, and eat in the afterlife. This spell was critical to the soul's journey, as it allowed the deceased to maintain a connection with their earthly existence while transitioning into the divine realm. These spells were recited during the mummification process and were meant to shield the soul from harm during its journey. Some of these spells were specifically designed to help the deceased pass through the gates of the duat, while others were meant to protect the body from decay and to ensure that the soul could reunite with it. The magical power of these spells was believed to be so strong that once recited, they could alter the course of fate itself. Osiris's resurrection was seen as a model for the journey of the soul, just as Osiris was reborn after his death. So too could the soul be reborn after passing through the trials of the duat. They were accompanied by a host of divine guides, protective deities, and powerful spells that offered assistance and ensured that the soul could overcome the various obstacles in the afterlife. These gods and deities were not only spiritual protectors, but also active participants in the soul's journey. The deceased had to rely on the gods' guidance to navigate the treacherous landscape of the duat and reach the final destination, the field of reeds, a paradise where the soul would live in eternal peace and harmony. If, however, the heart was weighed down with the burden of sin or wrongdoing, the soul would fail the trial and face eternal punishment. This moment in the duat represented the ultimate test of righteousness, where the soul's entire existence was judged against the principles of divine order. This balance was reflected in every aspect of their lives, from their daily activities to their rituals surrounding death. Life, for the Egyptians, was a constant struggle to maintain Ma'at, to live in balance and harmony with the gods and the natural world. Death was seen as the final reckoning, where the individual's life would be assessed by the gods. The weighing of the heart was the final judgment, and it determined whether the soul could continue its journey to eternal peace or whether it would be lost forever. It was Mat that ensured that the judgment of the deceased was fair and just, and it was Mat that determined whether the soul could successfully pass into the afterlife. The very fabric of Egyptian society was woven with rituals and practices aimed at ensuring a successful journey for the soul into the afterlife, a journey that would ultimately culminate in a reunion with the gods and an eternal existence. At the heart of this belief system was the powerful concept of Mat, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. As the deceased journeyed through the duat, the Egyptian underworld encountered various gods who would either aid or hinder their progress. Some of these deities, like Anubis, were benevolent figures who provided protection and guidance, while others, like the fearsome Ammit, symbolized the dangers of the afterlife evil forces that would attempt to derail the soul's passage. At the heart of the trials the soul faced was the weighing of the heart ceremony, a critical moment in the journey when the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma. The heart, which was considered the seat of the soul, had to be pure and free from sin in order for the soul to pass. If the heart was heavier than the feather, the soul would be devoured by a terrifying fate. But the weighing of the heart was not just a test of the soul's moral character, it was a symbolic representation of the larger cosmic balance that Mahat maintained. The idea that the afterlife was governed by divine law was central to Egyptian religious thought. However, the journey through the duat was not a solitary one. One of the most important gods in this journey was Osiris, the god of the afterlife, resurrection, and judgment. The belief in resurrection was also tied to the annual flooding of the Nile, which was seen as a symbol of life, death, and rebirth. However, the role of Osiris was not just symbolic, it was deeply practical. The journey through the duat was fraught with obstacles, and the deceased had to rely on the gods for guidance. One of the most powerful spells was the spell of the opening of the mouth, which was used to reanimate the body and allow the soul to reunite with it. But it wasn't just the rituals, spells, and gods that played a role in the journey through the afterlife. It was also the material culture that surrounded the deceased. The intricate carvings, murals, and inscriptions found in tombs were more than just artistic decorations. As you continue your journey through the world of Egyptian mummification and the afterlife, clear that death was not an end, but a continuation of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. As we dive deeper into the layers of Egyptian religious beliefs, it becomes clear that the entire culture was centered around the idea of immortality and the protection of the soul after death. This belief was not merely a personal one. It was woven into the very fabric of Egyptian society. It's fascinating to consider that the Egyptians viewed death as a natural part of the cycle of existence. It's not an end, but a continuation. This view is reflected in their approach to mummification. The embalming process was not an act of finality, but rather a vital part of the journey to eternity. It was understood as an essential ritual that ensured that the deceased could experience an afterlife that was not only eternal, but also filled with peace, joy, and renewal. The structure of the Tumit's architecture, decoration, and contents was designed to mirror the soul's passage through the various stages of the afterlife. This journey wasn't just about crossing through the gates of the Duat. It was about undergoing a spiritual transformation. Some scholars argue that the gods were seen as purely protective figures, while others believe that the gods were more actively involved in guiding the soul. It was also about achieving eternal peace and unity with the gods. Just as the Nile would flood and renew the land each year, so too did the soul undergo a process of renewal and rebirth, ensuring that it could live on for eternity. Through their careful preparation of the body, the tomb, and the soul, they ensured that death was not a finality, but a transition into an eternal realm of divine peace. The journey through the afterlife was one of spiritual transformation, renewal, and divine union. A process that guaranteed the soul's immortality and its eventual reunion with the gods. Death was not an end, it was a transformation. It's a journey that led to a new form of existence, where the soul could live in harmony with the divine. The field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, was the final destination of the soul, a place of eternal renewal, peace, and bliss. The soul's journey was not only a test of moral character, but also a process of spiritual purification, in which the soul was cleansed of all impurities and prepared for a life of eternal happiness. This final reward, eternal life in the field of reeds, was seen as the ultimate goal of the afterlife, a place where the soul would live in harmony with the gods, free from suffering and decay. What is clear, however, is that the gods were central to the Egyptian understanding of death and the afterlife. They were not just distant deities, They were active participants in the spiritual journey of the deceased, helping to ensure that the soul's passage was successful. They provided the guidance and protection the deceased needed to ensure a successful passage through the decode and into the afterlife. These interactions between the living and the dead were seen as vital for the soul's success. The living had a role to play in ensuring that the deceased received the protection and guidance they needed, and the gods were constantly invoked to provide assistance. The soul would pass through various stages, meeting different gods, receiving guidance, and ultimately achieving rebirth. This process was deeply symbolic of the renewal and regeneration that the Egyptians believed to be inherent in the natural world. The cycles of life, death, and rebirth were reflected not only in the world around them, but also in their religious beliefs about the afterlife. Tombs often included intricate murals, carvings, and inscriptions that depicted the journey of the soul, as well as the gods and spirits that would guide and protect it. The tomb was also filled with offerings that the deceased would need in the afterlife: food, drink, and other personal items meant to sustain the soul during its journey. Every individual, whether a pharaoh or a commoner, was expected to undergo the rites of mummification in order to ensure that their soul could continue on into the afterlife. Death was never seen as the end of one's existence. Instead, it was the beginning of a new chapter. The journey to the afterlife wasn't just a personal one, it was also a communal one. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, resurrection, and judgment, was the central figure in the Egyptian belief system about death and rebirth. His myth, which tells the story of his death, dismemberment, and resurrection, was symbolic of the larger cycle of life, death, and rebirth that the Egyptians believed in. Osiris's resurrection represented the soul's journey from death to immortality, a process that was mirrored in the lives of the deceased. Osiris was not only a god of the afterlife, but also a symbol of eternal renewal. The myth of Osiris, with its themes of death, rebirth, and transformation, encapsulated the very essence of Egyptian spiritual thought. The living had a duty to the deceased to ensure that the soul could pass into eternity. Offerings, prayers, and rituals were regularly performed, not only to honor the deceased, but also to ensure their protection in the afterlife. This practice was not just about the preservation of the body, it was about achieving eternal life, a central tenet of Egyptian spirituality. But how did this belief affect the way the Egyptians viewed life itself? This sense of continuity was deeply embedded in the Egyptians' daily lives. The idea of the soul's continued existence and the importance of mummification for its journey is reflected in the rich symbolism used in Egyptian tombs. These tombs were not just places for bodies, they were elaborate sanctuaries designed to protect the deceased in their journey. Every element of the tomb had significance. The burial chamber, the positioning of the body, the items placed inside, and the rituals performed were all part of a carefully orchestrated system, meant to guide the soul to its final resting place in the afterlife. The tombs themselves were symbolic of the transition from life to death. A key element in the Egyptian belief system was the idea that the soul's journey to the afterlife was not immediate, was a process that could take years, or even millennia to complete. The trials that the deceased faced in the afterlife were not meant to punish, but to test the purity of the soul. The focus on spiritual renewal and regeneration is also evident in the mythology of the gods themselves. The journey to the afterlife, as guided by Osiris and other deities, was not an easy one. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Egyptian belief system was their view of divine intervention. This divine relationship wasn't just about asking for favors, it was about maintaining a cosmic balance. Historians continue to debate the exact role of the gods in the Egyptian afterlife. But the journey to the afterlife wasn't just about passing through trials and receiving divine protection. In this way, the journey to the afterlife was a reflection of the larger cycles of life and death that the Egyptians observed in nature. The Egyptian mummification process, with all its rituals, spells, and divine protections, was not just a way to preserve the body, it was a profound expression of the Egyptians' belief in immortality and the continuity of life. As we continue this journey through the fascinating and complex world of Egyptian beliefs about death and the afterlife, it becomes increasingly clear that the Egyptians were not simply concerned with preserving the body or ensuring the soul's journey to the afterlife. They also believed in the intimate relationship between the living and the dead. It reflects a deep respect for the ancestors and an understanding that life and death are not separate but rather intertwined. The living maintained a spiritual connection with the dead, ensuring that their ancestors' spirits would continue to provide blessings and protection. These prayers were recited at regular intervals, often during annual festivals or special occasions. Many tombs contained inscriptions or carved images of the deceased, often depicted as living figures, showing their ability to continue their existence in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that the spirit of the deceased could continue to interact with the living, offering guidance and protection. Ancestor worship was a vital part of this belief system, as the deceased were seen as guardians of the living. The Egyptians had a profound respect for the natural world, and they saw death as a natural part of the life cycle. Just as the Nile would flood and renew the land each year, so too would the soul undergo a process of renewal and rebirth in the afterlife. This belief in cyclical renewal was tied to their understanding of the natural world and the forces that governed it. The mummification process, with its complex rituals and divine protections, was designed to facilitate this transformation. It was a means of ensuring that the soul would continue its journey through the afterlife. reborn and purified, ready to join the gods in eternal peace. The relationship between the living and the dead was central to this belief system, ensuring that the connection between the two realms was never broken. Life, death, and rebirth were seen as interconnected, each one leading to the next in an endless divine cycle. The Egyptians understood that death was not an end. It was a transformation, a passage to a new form of existence. Through mummification and the rituals that accompanied it, they ensured that the soul would continue to exist, forever in the presence of the gods, in a world of eternal peace and renewal. They were believed to have the ability to intervene in the world of the living, providing blessings, guidance for the Egyptians. Time was not linear but cyclical. They saw the past, present, and future as interwoven, with the actions of the living affecting the world of the dead and vice versa. The annual flooding of the Nile was a powerful symbol of this cyclical view of time. The floodwaters would come every year, replenishing the land and ensuring the fertility of the soil. In the same way, the soul's journey through the afterlife was seen as a renewal, a process of purification and transformation that ensured the continuity of life and the world order, and protection in exchange for the offerings and rituals performed by the living. The physical act of embalming the body was a means of ensuring that the soul would have a vessel to inhabit in the afterlife. But the ritual was also a spiritual act, one that was tied to the larger belief in life, death, and renewal. By preserving the body, the Egyptians were ensuring that the cycle of life would continue, both for the deceased and for the living. The soul's journey through the afterlife was not just about individual transformation, it was about maintaining the cosmic balance, ensuring that the forces of life and death were in harmony. This relationship was seen as crucial to the well-being of the family and the community as a whole. These depictions of the deceased as active participants in the afterlife were not just artistic representations. They were believed to be magical symbols, enabling the deceased to maintain a connection with the living world. By viewing these images, the living could connect with their ancestors, invoking their protection and blessings. The rituals surrounding the deceased were designed to ensure that the soul continued to receive protection, blessings, and sustenance as it traveled through the afterlife. These rituals were performed by priests and family members alike, ensuring that the connection between the living and the dead was maintained. And in return, the deceased, if properly honored, would ensure the prosperity and well-being of their descendants. The living had an essential role to play in ensuring the success of the deceased's passage to eternity. This relationship was not one-sided, it was reciprocal. The relationship between the living and the dead was an ongoing one, and it was seen as a necessary part of maintaining the balance of the universe. The Egyptians understood that the world was governed by cycles of seasons, of life and of death, then that the afterlife was merely the next step in this eternal cycle. The living performed rituals, made offerings, and recited prayers to help the souls journey, but in return, the deceased were expected to watch over and protect their descendants, ensuring the continuity of the family's legacy and the prosperity of future generations. The practice of honoring the dead was central to Egyptian culture, and it extended far beyond the tombs of the pharaohs and nobles. Even the most common individuals, though their tombs might be simpler, were still buried with care, and their souls were seen as integral parts of the larger cosmic order. The Egyptians believed that the soul of a deceased individual could continue to influence the lives of their descendants, offering blessings, protection, and guidance. This practice was not just a symbolic act, it was believed to sustain the soul in the afterlife. The offerings would be made at the tomb, where the deceased spirit was thought to reside. These offerings included foods such as bread, meat, and vegetables, as well as drink, typically wine or beer. In some cases, the tomb would also contain smaller models of food or servants, meant to provide the deceased with sustenance and comfort. These offerings were essential to maintaining the bond between the living and the dead. It wasn't just the pharaohs who were believed to have divine power in the afterlife. The souls of all Egyptians, regardless of their earthly status, played a role in the ongoing spiritual life of the community. This reciprocal relationship between the living and the dead is one of the most striking features of Egyptian religious life. A key aspect of this relationship was the regular offering of food, drink, and incense to the dead. Beyond food and drink, the Egyptians also offered prayers and incantations to the dead. The Egyptians also believed that the deceased had the ability to influence the living world in other ways. But it wasn't just the physical connection to the deceased that mattered, it was also the spiritual connection. In the Egyptian worldview, death was never an end. It was simply another phase in the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. This cyclical understanding of life and death was reflected not only in the religious practices surrounding mummification, but also in the broader cultural worldview of the Egyptians. The Egyptians' focus on the cyclical nature of life and death also influenced their views on time. The importance of mummification, then, is not just in the preservation of the physical body, but in its role as a key component of this eternal cycle. As you reflect on the intricate nature of the Egyptian belief system, it becomes clear that the afterlife was not just a realm of judgment, it was a realm of transformation, renewal, and eternal connection. This profound belief in the continuity of life, death, and rebirth is what made Egyptian religion so powerful and enduring. As the journey into the heart of ancient Egyptian mummification and the afterlife deepens, it becomes increasingly evident how deeply entwined death, immortality, and the divine were in Egyptian culture. For the Egyptians, the mummification process was more than just a physical preservation. It was a spiritual and metaphysical act of ensuring that the soul would continue on, transformed and eternally connected to the divine. The Ka represented the vital essence of the person, the animating force that could not die but would continue to exist in the afterlife. They saw it as a transition into another phase of existence, where the soul could continue to live and interact with the world. This view was reflected in the elaborate tombs and burial practices, which were designed to provide for the soul's needs. The process itself was steeped in symbolism and was not performed simply for preservation. It was a method of ensuring that the soul would be able to reunite with the body and continue on its journey through the afterlife. Some scholars argue that these priests were trained in a detailed and complex system of embalming and magical rituals, while others suggest that their role was more ceremonial, rooted in their religious function rather than their technical skills. What remains clear, however, is that the act of mummification was not a simple mechanical process. It's a deeply spiritual one carried out with the intent of preserving the soul's ability to transcend death and live in the afterlife. The embalming priests were seen as spiritual intermediaries, helping to guide the deceased through the transition from life to death. The pyramid texts, which were carved into the walls of royal tombs, were some of the oldest and most important religious texts in Egypt. It wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul, and the soul's ability to transcend death and live forever. Through their complex rituals, their belief in the afterlife, and their devotion to the gods, the Egyptians ensured that death was not the end. Instead, it was a new beginning, a beginning that continued for eternity. These texts were believed to contain the divine words necessary for the king's transformation into an immortal god. The coffin texts, a later development, served a similar purpose for non-royal individuals, providing them with the spells and incantations needed for their own spiritual transformation. These texts, like the Book of the Dead, were not just symbolic. They were practical tools designed to ensure the soul's success in the afterlife. This collection of spells, incantations, and prayers was designed to guide the soul through the perilous journey of the duat, and to ensure that it could pass through the gates and challenges of the afterlife. For the Egyptians, the words of the Book of the Dead were not just symbolic, they were believed to have real power. Their beliefs were a reflection of their reverence for the divine and their understanding of the cycles of nature. The mummification process, with all its rituals and complexities, was a profound expression of their belief in immortality, rebirth, and the eternal continuity of life. It was a spiritual practice that ensured that no matter what happened in this life, the soul would live on forever in the presence of the gods. The very act of reciting these spells or placing them in the tomb ensured that the soul would have the divine assistance it needed to pass through the afterlife successfully. The Book of the Dead was as much a physical tool as a spiritual one. It provided the deceased with the guidance they needed to navigate the treacherous realms of the underworld and reach the eternal paradise of the gods. The Book of the Dead was not just a guide, it was a spiritual tool, a weapon against the forces of evil and chaos that sought to prevent the soul's passage into eternity. The spells within the book were meant to invoke divine protection, to grant the soul the wisdom and strength it needed to pass through the trials of the afterlife. Their role was not just that of caretakers. They were also responsible for ensuring that the deceased could achieve immortality. This spiritual role was grounded in their deep understanding of Ma'at and their belief that the balance of the universe depended on the proper performance of rituals. The Egyptians believed that words, when spoken correctly, had the ability to influence the world and the divine. This is why the priests, who were responsible for performing the embalming rituals and reciting the necessary incantations, were seen as powerful figures within Egyptian society. Their ability to speak the sacred words of the gods was believed to have the power to transform the soul, ensuring its passage into eternity. The tomb was not just a final resting place. It was a space where the deceased could continue their journey, provided with food, drink, and spiritual protections. The act of mummification, then, was not just a physical process, but a symbolic one in effort to ensure that the soul would never be lost, but would always be able to return to the body, sustaining its connection to the world of the living. It was the responsibility of the living to ensure the Ka was properly cared for. The Egyptians believed that the universe was governed by Mat, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. Mat was seen as the embodiment of divine order, the force that ensured balance and harmony in the world. This belief in Mat extended to death and the afterlife as well. The journey through the Du'ayat, the Egyptian underworld, was not simply about judgment or trial. It was a process of spiritual purification, a process that ensured the soul could achieve Mat and pass into the afterlife, where it would live in eternal harmony with the gods. This was done through rituals, prayers, and offerings that were meant to sustain the Ka in the afterlife. Without proper care, the Ka would become lost, and the deceased would be condemned to a wandering existence. In this sense, the Ka was not just a spiritual essence, it was a vital part of the individual that needed to be nourished, honored, and kept alive through the rituals of the living. But it wasn't just about what happened after death. The rituals and beliefs surrounding mummification also had profound meanings for the living, shaping how they viewed life, the cosmos, and their place within it. The process of mummification was a ritualistic pathway, not only for ensuring the soul's protection and immortality, but also for affirming the connection between the living and the dead. The tomb wasn't just a resting place for the body. It was a sacred space that helped maintain the ongoing relationship between both realms. For the Egyptians, this relationship was reciprocal. The living were responsible for maintaining the memory of the deceased, providing offerings, and ensuring the proper performance of rituals. In return, the deceased were believed to provide blessings, protection, and spiritual guidance to the living. It was a symbiotic connection, one that reinforced the idea that death was not the end, but a continuation of life, albeit in a different realm. This duality of existence, with the living and the dead working together to maintain cosmic order, is embodied in the concept of Ka, a part of the soul. As you reflect on the nature of the Ka, it becomes clear that the Egyptians did not simply view death as a cessation of life. The idea of the Ka was deeply connected to the larger Egyptian understanding of life in the cosmos. This divine order was reflected in the rituals of mummification. Interestingly, the exact role of the embalming priests remains a subject of debate among historians. One of the key elements of this spiritual journey was the Book of the Dead. The importance of the Book of the Dead is underscored by the fact that it was often placed in the tomb alongside the deceased. This belief in the power of words and magic was central to Egyptian religion. Beyond the Book of the Dead, there were other magical texts that played a role in the mummification process. In the end, it was this combination of physical preservation, divine protection, and spiritual transformation that made Egyptian mummification so powerful. As we finish this deep exploration into the afterlife, mummification, and the spiritual journey of the deceased, It's clear that the Egyptians had an incredibly sophisticated understanding of life and death. As you journey further into the intricacies of Egyptian mummification and afterlife beliefs, it becomes clear that the Egyptians were not simply focused on preparing the body for eternal preservation. They were also deeply concerned with ensuring that the soul had everything it needed to succeed in the afterlife and continue its journey toward rebirth and immortality. While the physical act of mummification may seem like the most prominent aspect of this process, it was only one part of a much larger, more spiritual narrative that spanned from life to death and ultimately to eternity. The Egyptians viewed the afterlife as a realm of divine continuity, where the soul would undergo transformation and rebirth. As Horus struggled to reclaim his father Osiris's throne, he symbolized the soul's quest for spiritual rebirth after death. The victory over Set and the eventual restoration of Osiris's reign represented the overcoming of chaos and the return of cosmic order, a key theme in the Egyptian understanding of death. However, it was not an easy journey, and the soul had to pass through numerous trials to prove its worthiness. The heart, as the seat of the soul, was thought to hold the essence of the individual's moral character. It was weighed against the feather of Mat, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. If the heart was found to be in balance with Mat, the soul would be granted entry into the afterlife. But if the heart was weighed down with guilt, evil, or sin, the soul would be cast into oblivion, devoured by the monster Ammit. The Egyptians did not just revere the gods for their power, they saw them as active participants in the process of spiritual transformation. The connection between the gods and the soul was intimate and personal. As the soul passed through the afterlife, it was constantly under the watchful eye of the gods, who provided both protection and judgment. The ultimate goal was to reunite with the divine, achieving immortality and eternal peace. The gods provided the guidance, protection, and assistance needed to navigate the perilous journey through the duat. They did not simply offer blessings. They provided the framework for the soul's transformation. By undergoing the trials of the afterlife and achieving spiritual purification, the soul could attain a divine, immortal state. The gods were not merely symbols of power. They were the facilitators of the soul's journey toward rebirth. They were the ones who determined the fate of the soul, ensuring that those who lived righteously would be rewarded with eternal life, and those who failed the trials would be cast into oblivion. This trial was not just a test of morality, it was a symbolic cleansing, a purification of the soul to ensure that it was worthy of eternity. The heart, as the center of one's being, had to be pure, free from the weight of wrongdoings. These trials were depicted in various texts and rituals, such as the Book of the Dead and the coffin texts, which provided the deceased with the necessary spells and knowledge to navigate the perils of the duat, the Egyptian underworld. It was a transition, a passage that held the potential for spiritual growth, transformation, and rebirth. Through the act of mummification, the soul was given the opportunity to continue its journey into eternity. Guided by the divine, protected by magic, and purified through trials, it was this belief in the eternal nature of the soul and its capacity for renewal that made Egyptian mummification so powerful and lasting. In the duat, the soul encountered various gods and spirits, each with their own role in the purification process. Some scholars argue that the trials were meant to mirror the moral choices the deceased had made in life, while others believe they represented the various obstacles the soul would face on its path to purification. This was the place of Aru, the Egyptian paradise, where the soul would be reborn into an eternal existence. Here, the soul would be reunited with its physical body and would achieve Akka state of divine immortality. In the field of reeds, the soul would live forever in peace, free from the trials of the duat and the dangers of chaos. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth would continue, as the soul would eventually take part in the eternal cycle of cosmic renewal, regardless of their interpretation. These trials underscored the importance of moral behavior and the need for divine guidance in navigating the afterlife. Some gods provided protection and guidance, while others posed obstacles. For example, the soul might encounter Circuit, the scorpion goddess, who was charged with guarding the gates of the afterlife. To pass through her domain, the soul would need the protection of magical spells and divine assistance. It was this guidance from the gods and the use of magic that allowed the soul to pass through the many layers of the afterlife. The duat was filled with dark, chaotic forces, represented by serpents, demons, and other terrifying beings that sought to prevent the soul from passing into the afterlife. The soul's journey was fraught with danger, but it was also one of great opportunity for purification and spiritual growth. The soul, having passed through the necessary trials, would eventually return to Osiris, just as Horus had returned to his father's side. In this way, Horus symbolized both the challenge and the ultimate reward of the afterlife. This journey was not merely a linear progression, it was a spiritual cycle, continuous loop in which death marked the beginning of a new life. The Ba, the spiritual essence of the individual, was believed to travel through the underworld, seeking a reunion with the Ka, the life force that had originally animated the body. The Ba and Ka were not separate entities. They were two essential components of the soul that needed to be united for the soul to achieve immortality. This union was symbolic of the spiritual resurrection, an essential component of the Egyptian belief in life after death. The soul's ultimate transformation into an eternal, immortal being could only be completed once the Ka and Ba had successfully reunited. It was this belief in cyclical renewal that formed the foundation of many Egyptian religious practices. From the tomb paintings that depicted the journey of the deceased through the afterlife to the offerings placed in tombs, every aspect of Egyptian burial practices was designed to facilitate the soul's transition into eternity. However, more than just the physical aspects of the process were involved, there was a deep focus on transformation. The purification of the soul and the ultimate reunion with the divine. The key to understanding the Egyptians' profound belief in spiritual transformation lies in their understanding of Horus, the sky god and son of Osiris. Horus was not just a god of kingship and power, he was also seen as a symbol of rebirth and renewal, mythology intertwined with the very concept of mummification. According to Egyptian beliefs, Horus was the god who had triumphed over death, a victor over chaos, and a defender of cosmic order. His very essence symbolized the eternal struggle between order and chaos, and through his strength and determination, he gave the deceased a model to follow on their journey to immortality. Horus myth, which tells the story of his triumph over Set, the god of disorder, also mirrored the soul's journey through the afterlife. But it wasn't just the gods who played a role in the afterlife. The deceased themselves had an active part to play in the spiritual transformation process. It was through this spiritual process of transformation that the soul would be granted access to the afterlife. Among the most significant trials the soul had to face was the weighing of the heart. Yet while the weighing of the heart was undoubtedly the most significant trial, it was only one of many challenges the soul had to overcome. Historians still debate whether the Egyptians truly believed these trials and encounters were literal or symbolic representations of the soul's spiritual journey. Once the soul had successfully passed through these trials, it would finally reach the realm of Osiris, where it would undergo the final stages of spiritual purification. But what of the gods themselves? How did they fit into this complex narrative of death and rebirth? The gods, particularly Osiris and Ra, were not distant, unattainable deities. They were accessible and present in the spiritual journey of the deceased. In many ways, this belief in the divine role in the afterlife reflected the Egyptians' view of the gods as both protectors and judges. As you reflect on the Egyptian worldview, it's clear that death was not merely the end of life. As the journey into the Egyptian belief system about death and the afterlife unfolds, it becomes increasingly apparent that the Egyptians had a profound understanding of life's cyclical nature. They did not see death as a finality. Rather, it was a natural and inevitable part of a divine, eternal cycle. Their reverence for nature, the cycles of the seasons, and the celestial movements were closely interwoven with their religious practices, including mummification. The annual flooding of the Nile, for example, was symbolic of the divine rebirth that the soul would undergo in the afterlife. Just as the floodwaters rejuvenated the land, so too would the soul be revitalized in the afterlife, receiving new life, peace, and immortality. Mat's feather was used in the weighing of the heart, and her principle of order governed not just the afterlife, but the entirety of the universe. The afterlife was, in many ways, a reflection of the cosmic balance that governed the living world. The journey of the soul was tied to the order of the universe, with divine forces maintaining that order and ensuring that the soul could continue its journey in peace. They were believed to hold real power. The Egyptians understood that words had the ability to shape reality, and the proper recitation of spells could alter the fate of the deceased. The deceased were not left to wander the underworld alone. The gods were always present, ready to offer guidance and protection. As the soul passed through the various stages of the afterlife, they were guided by the deities, who provided wisdom, strength, and divine favor. It wasn't just about the preservation of the body, it was about ensuring the soulless immortality, its rebirth, and its union with the divine. The living played an active role in this process, performing rituals, making offerings, and ensuring that the deceased received the spiritual protection they needed. The entire mummification ritual, from the embalming to the tomb, was an elaborate expression of the Egyptians' belief in the continuity of life, death, and rebirth. The Egyptians believed that the gods were deeply involved in every stage of the soul's journey, from the moment of death to the final judgment in the afterlife. The Egyptians also believed in the possibility of spiritual renewal during their lifetimes. The idea of regeneration and spiritual purification was not confined to the dead. It was also a part of the living experience. Rituals and offerings were regularly performed to maintain spiritual balance and harmony, and the gods were invoked to ensure that the cycles of life remained intact. In this sense, the Egyptians viewed the mummification process as more than just a posthumous act. It was a fundamental reflection of their worldview, one that embraced both life and death as part of an eternal, divine cycle. The Book of the Dead was, in essence, a guide to navigating the underworld. Were the trials the soul faced a symbolic reflection of spiritual growth or a literal test of worthiness? For the Egyptians, life and death were part of an eternal cycle. Through mummification, they sought to ensure that death was not an end, but a continuation of the cosmic order, a journey towards spiritual rebirth and divine unity. What is certain is that the Egyptian mummification process, its rituals, magic, and divine protections, was a key element in helping the soul achieve immortality. The entire system was designed to preserve the soul, protect it, and ultimately transform it into an eternal being. And it contains spells for passing through gates, overcoming obstacles, and calling upon the gods for protection. These tombs, often discovered in vast cemeteries, reveal the lengths to which the Egyptians went to ensure the soul a safe passage to the afterlife. From the humble offerings of food and drink to the more elaborate inclusion of magical spells and amulets, the rituals surrounding death were seen as essential, regardless of one's social rank. It was a practical manual, one that ensured the soul would be well equipped for the journey. The relationship between the gods and the deceased was a crucial aspect of this belief system. Without the gods' protection and guidance, the soul would be lost forever, condemned to wander aimlessly in the underworld. The weighing of the heart was, therefore, more than just a moral judgment. It was a cosmic reckoning where the deceased's life was measured against the fundamental principles of divine balance. While the pharaohs had grand tombs filled with treasures and offerings, the same basic principles of mummification and afterlife belief applied to all Egyptians, regardless of status. The tombs of commoners may not have been as elaborate, but they were still designed to ensure the soul's success in the afterlife. The priests who performed the mummification process were skilled in the rituals and prayers needed to prepare the deceased for the afterlife, and even the simplest tombs were filled with the essential items for spiritual transformation. The process of embalming, wrapping the body in linen, and placing it in the tomb was an essential part of this spiritual transformation. But this process was also about providing the deceased with the tools they needed to navigate the afterlife. The spells and prayers found in the Book of the Dead were not merely texts. They were powerful incantations that helped the deceased move through the afterlife's challenges, ensuring that they would be protected and guided by the gods. The heart, representing the individual's morality and actions during life, weighed against Mat's feather, which symbolized truth and justice. If the heart was found to be in balance, the soul would pass into the afterlife, entering a realm of eternal peace. If the heart was heavy with sin, the soul would face eternal annihilation. Consumed by the devouring goddess Ammit, this cycle comprising birth, death, and rebirth was central to how they viewed the soul's existence, and the mummification process itself was seen as the cornerstone of this eternal renewal. This state of existence was believed to be reached after passing through the trials of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, and achieving spiritual purification. The soul, upon entering the field of reeds, could live in peace, free from earthly suffering and decay. But this wasn't just about individual spiritual renewal. It was also about the cosmic order. The soul's rebirth represented a cosmic harmony, a renewal of both the individual and the larger world, much like the cyclical flooding of the Nile that renewed the earth every year. Each phase of the process, from the embalming to the final interment in the tomb, is designed not only to preserve the body, but also to facilitate the soul's transition through the afterlife, ensuring its eventual resurrection. However, as you step back and look at this complex spiritual and physical journey, the Egyptians' belief system reveals that their views on the afterlife were deeply tied to their understanding of the natural world. Central to this belief was the concept of the Akuda transformed soul. The Egyptians also believed that the journey of the deceased was not one that was to be undertaken alone. The gods played a central role in this journey, guiding, protecting, and ensuring the success of the soul's transformation. While Osiris was the god of the afterlife, resurrection, and judgment, other deities had specific roles in aiding the soul's progress. Anubis, the god of embalming and the protector of graves, oversaw the mummification process and ensured the soul's safe passage through the underworld. Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, recorded the soul's deeds and judgments. Together, these gods helped to ensure that the deceased would be granted access to the afterlife. One of the most important figures in this divine system was Mat, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. This belief system underscores how the Egyptians did not merely see death as an individual experience. It's clear then that mummification was not just about preserving the physical body. It was about facilitating the soul's journey through the afterlife. The magical texts contained in the tombs of the deceased were not just symbolic. Yet while the journey was fraught with challenges, it was also filled with divine assistance. This belief in divine intervention and protection was not limited to the royal class. In fact, some of the most striking examples of Egyptian mummification come from the tombs of non-royal individuals. The mummification process was, therefore, an integral part of Egyptian society and spirituality. But the concept of rebirth wasn't limited to the afterlife. Historians still debate how the Egyptians viewed the afterlife. Was it a place of eternal peace or a world of constant transformation? As we reflect on this grand tapestry of belief, we come to understand that the Egyptians' approach to death was as much a philosophy of life as it was about death itself. As we reach the final stretch of our journey through the ancient Egyptian views on death, mummification, and the afterlife, it becomes clear just how deeply embedded these beliefs were in every facet of Egyptian life. The Egyptians saw life and death as part of a continuous cycle: birth, life, death, and rebirth. Once the soul had passed through the duat, the underworld, and past the trials of the afterlife, it would reach the field of reeds, a paradise where the soul would be reborn. The soul's rebirth was not just a spiritual purification, but a literal resurrection. Every Egyptian, regardless of social status, underwent the mummification process in order to ensure their soul's successful passage into the afterlife, even those who couldn't move forward. Elaborate tombs still received the protection of the gods through the same spiritual processes. This idea of universal immortality was a key feature of Egyptian religion. Wasn't just the pharaohs who were granted eternal life, but all Egyptians? Their belief in immortality was not just a spiritual abstraction. It was deeply connected to their understanding of life, nature, and the cosmos. For thousands of years, the mummies of ancient Egypt have captured the imaginations of people around the world. From the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb to the excavation of the pyramids, the mummies of Egypt have continued to fascinate archaeologists, historians, and the public alike. But what is it about these ancient mummies that continues to captivate us? In the spiritual beliefs, we come to realize that the Egyptians' understanding of life, death, and the afterlife was far more than just religious dogma. Through their mummies, tombs, and rituals, the Egyptians have left us a legacy that continues to captivate and fascinate. Their belief in the eternal nature of the soul, in the cycles of life, death, and rebirth is something that speaks to the heart of human existence, our desire for continuity, for meaning, and for connection to something greater than ourselves. It was a worldview that encompassed every aspect of their lives: social, political, and spiritual. The process of mummification, the journey through the duat, and the final transformation into the OC were all part of a larger system that was designed to ensure the soul's immortality and its eternal connection to the divine. It was a system that helped the Egyptians understand their place in the cosmos, their connection to the gods, and their legacy in the world. The afterlife was not a distant, separate realm. It was an extension of the living world, a place where the soul would continue to exist and interact with the living. Thanks to the Egyptians' sophisticated embalming techniques, many mummies have been preserved for thousands of years, offering us a glimpse into the past like no other artifact. For the Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a continuation of life, a journey toward eternal rebirth. The mummification process was not just about preserving the body. It was about preserving the soul, ensuring that the deceased would continue to live on in peace and harmony with the gods for all eternity. This belief in immortality, this desire to transcend death, resonates with us on a fundamental level. It speaks to our own fears and hopes about life and death, our desire for continuity and connection, and our longing for something greater than ourselves. These mummies allow us to connect with the ancient Egyptians in a way that no written record or archaeological find can. They bring to life the faces of long-dead rulers, priests, and commoners. And they offer a tangible connection to a civilization that, while ancient, was incredibly advanced in its understanding of life, death, and the afterlife. The rituals of mummification and the offerings to the deceased were an essential part of maintaining this connection between the worlds, ensuring that the gods' favor would continue to bless the living. The belief in the afterlife transcended social class, and everyone, no matter their status, could hope for a place in the eternal realm. This resurrection was seen as the soul's return to life, a life that was eternal and free from the decay of the physical world. The living were responsible for maintaining the connection between the realms of the living and the dead. The pharaoh, as the divine ruler, was seen as the intermediary between the gods and the people. The pharaoh's mummification was not just a personal matter, it was a political one. By ensuring that the pharaoh would continue to live in the afterlife, the Egyptians believed that they were securing the stability and prosperity of the state. The pharaoh's continued existence in the afterlife was seen as essential to maintaining cosmic order and ensuring that the Nile would flood each year, bringing fertility to the land. The mummification of the pharaoh was a ritual of immense national importance, one that symbolized the eternal reign of the gods over Egypt. Through the offering of food, prayers, and rituals, the living ensured that their ancestors' souls would be protected, and that they would continue to offer guidance and blessings to their descendants. The tomb was a space where the living and the dead could interact, where the ancestors could continue to influence the world of the living. This interaction was seen as essential to the continued success and prosperity of the family, the community, and the state. The soul was not simply reunited with the body, it was transformed into an eternal, divine being, capable of experiencing life in a new, immortal form. They believed that this cycle mirrored the natural world around them, the annual flooding of the Nile, the cycles of the moon, and the movement of the stars. The process of mummification was not just a private affair, it was a public one, deeply intertwined with the spiritual and political life of the Egyptian state. The pharaohs, the divine rulers of Egypt, were seen as gods on earth, and their mummification was a public spectacle, carried out with elaborate rituals that reinforced their divine status. These rituals, which included the embalming of the body, the offering of food and drink, and the recitation of prayers, were meant to ensure that the pharaoh would continue to rule in the afterlife. The pharaoh's tomb, filled with treasures and offerings, was a testament to their eternal power, a power that would transcend death. This cyclical understanding of existence was reflected in their mummification practices, which were not simply about preserving the body for eternity, but about facilitating the soul's transition to a renewed existence. From the pharaohs to the commoners, the preparation for death and the reverence for the divine were integral to the spiritual fabric of society. It is in this final section that we explore how these beliefs, rituals, and practices shaped not only the dead, but the living, and the legacy of this ancient civilization, which continues to captivate us today. At the heart of Egyptian religion was the belief in immortality, not just as a personal experience, but as a cosmic truth. The concept of rebirth was central to Egyptian mummification. As we step back and reflect on the rituals and practices surrounding mummification, it's easy to see how these beliefs shaped Egyptian culture. But the mummification process wasn't just for the elite. While the tombs of the common people were often less elaborate, the same basic principles applied. In this sense, mummification was not just a spiritual practice, it was a social one. The rituals surrounding mummification and the afterlife were deeply tied to the political structure of Egypt as well. As you reflect on this, it becomes clear that the Egyptians were not simply concerned with the afterlife, they were concerned with the present world as well. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian mummification is the enduring legacy it has left behind. Part of the fascination lies in the incredible preservation of the bodies. But beyond the physical preservation of the mummies, there is something deeply moving about the way the Egyptians viewed death and the afterlife. As we reflect on the intricacies of Egyptian mummification, the importance of the gods, the rituals, and as we close this chapter of our journey, we are left with the realization that the Egyptians' belief in immortality and the afterlife continues to influence and inspire us today.